of mass destruction in Iraq. He's one of the most senior intelligence officers with on-the-ground experience to have worked in Iraq before, during, and after the Gulf War. His 2004 CIA report is widely renowned as the most authoritative account on how the world was led to believe that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. But until now, Mr. Dolfer has never publicly shared his unrivaled expertise on how the U.S.-Iraq relationship turned into a second war. He was also, as I said earlier, a former public policy scholar at the Wilson Center and worked on this book partly here. Robert Litvak, as I said, is a director of international security studies at the Wilson Center. He has served on the National Security Council staff as director for non-proliferation in the first Clinton administration. His most recent books are Rogue States and U.S. Foreign Policy, Containment After the Cold War, and Regime Change, U.S. Strategy Through the Prism of 9/11. We are delighted to have both of them here, and as I said earlier, there are passages in this book which just stay with you, but the one that stuck to my mind, and I think I'll never get over it, was when Mr. Dolfer says, in Washington, U.S. policy was being formulated by college freshmen. By the end of the war, they would be graduate students, and rebuilding the wreckage of Iraq would be their graduate master's thesis in political science. This really gave me the chill. Charles, you will have half an hour, followed by Rob, and then we will open the floor to your questions and comments. Could I ask you to close your cell phones, because we are having live webcast and it will interfere with that. So please close your BlackBerries, cell phones, and every gadget you have with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I do appreciate everything the Woodrow Wilson Center has done for me over the years. I did spend some very, very enriching months here between two of my excursions into Iraq. So I'm grateful for the Woodrow Wilson Center's support. Let me also say, as a preface, that this current book that I have is not meant in any way to adjust or spin or comment on the report which was done in 2004. That report, stands on its own. I think it has withstood the test of time, and anything in my current book is not meant to adjust that in any way. My publisher and others have said, what is it that your book is about in 20 words or less? And I've often, I suppose as many authors do, they have trouble boiling things down to a bumper sticker. And when forced to boil things down to a bumper sticker, I guess, well, I would have a few, but the one which I guess is prominent is that the major mistake in the current circumstances that we fell into in Iraq was not so much the intelligence errors with respect to weapons of mass destruction, but I think the far more costly mistake were the intelligence, the failure to use intelligence concerning the dynamics, the internal dynamics in Iraq, because it is my thesis that something had to be done about the Iraq regime under Saddam, but it by no means had to be this costly. The role of intelligence is important throughout the tale, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned in the course of the the past 2.5 decades in looking at Iraq from Washington, but also in terms of looking at Washington from Baghdad. And that is one of the perspectives that I was attempting to infuse this book with, was the Iraqi perspective. It happened that I was perhaps one of the few, if not the only, senior American who had regular contact and dialogue with the Saddam regime throughout the 1990s. These days, everybody and their dog has been to Iraq and is now an Iraq expert. But in the period of time leading up to when critical decisions were made with respect to what to do about Baghdad, there were very few Americans who had spoken to living, breathing Iraqis who had not left Iraq decades earlier. And that had an enormous effect on intelligence and policy making. So throughout this book, there are themes which apply to how intelligence informs policy. There are, without being explicit, there is a pattern where mindsets and biases, to use jargon which is current now in the intelligence community and critical thinking generally, but how mindsets and biases were generated over time. I try to lay those out both from the perspective of Washington, but also from the perspective of Baghdad. Looking backwards, there are reasons why Saddam made the decisions that he made. And if you delve into the world as he saw it, and this was a process that I and my colleagues at UNSCOM did, and most explicitly that myself and my colleagues in the Iraq Survey Group did in the post-war period in Iraq, we tried to understand what filled Saddam's windscreen. It tells a lot. To go into a little bit of history, not that anyone here needs that, but just it sets up a couple of the points I wish to make. Saddam came to power in 1979, and the world in 1979 was, of course, much different. Jimmy Carter was president. Afghanistan was not an American war. It was something that the Russians were about to invade in December of 1979. What filled the windscreen in Washington were U.S.-Soviet relations. A room full of people like this would more than likely be talking about NATO Warsaw Pact balance or something where the dynamic that was major at that time was East-West. Anything having to do in the Gulf region was out of area, which was, some other people worked on that. So that was the dominant factor in 1979, 1980, and when Saddam came to power, the other, of course, important thing going on was the Iranian Revolution. And there was this famous time when Carter visited Tehran, when the Shah was, still there and on his last legs, but nobody knew it. And he said it was nice to be there in this island of stability in the Middle East. And then, months later, that island had, disintegrated, and Americans were being held hostage, and so on and so forth. Well, from Saddam's perspective, this was very interesting. Saddam had, of course, a great deal of concern about Iran. It was the historic enemy of the Arab world from his perspective. And there was an event which was constantly brought to my attention by Tariq Aziz and others. And he said, in April of 1980, I was at the Mustansiriya University in Baghdad, and I was attacked by these Dawa people with hand grenades. And that turned out to be, an important point. It never resonated with me until years later. But when Tariq Aziz told the story, he said that was very important. And the next day, Saddam went to Mustansiriya and gave a very vitriolic speech, proceeded to throw a lot of Iranian Iraqis, as he tended to describe them, out of Iraq, and then proceeded down a path which ultimately led to his invasion of Iran in September. which, when you look at it from his perspective, there was a logic in back of that. Looking at Iran as his primary threat, it was at a point of weakness. The Khomeini people were decimating the powerful army of the Shah. Generals were being exiled or killed and so on. And at the same time, from Saddam's perspective, he's seeing a threat internally. So he decides to do something which, years later has become jargon in this town, a preemptive war. And he invaded, and much of the logic made sense, but I think, if there was one thing which he miscalculated on, it was the potency of the demographic imbalance. As there are today, there are roughly there were three times as many Iranians as there were Iraqis. So that, the war proceeded for 8 long years. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The United States decided that it could not afford to have Iraq lose. It tilted towards Iraq. Saddam, noticed this. Saddam was provided with a lot of support by Western countries, financial, military, and intelligence. The United States was providing intelligence to Iraq. I remember at the time there were periods when information was passed about Iranian troop concentrations in the, I think it was I can't remember exactly, but the Third Corps, which is the Central Front. And of course, Saddam immediately used one of his, what turned out to be a life-saving weapon for him, chemical munitions. He used 101,000 chemical munitions to help defeat the Iranian attacks against Iraq, the human wave attacks at the time. And he was using American intelligence to do that. And, people in Washington were not naive about that. They knew that was going on. Every once in a while, the United States would make a statement about that, chemical weapons were bad. But judging by actions, if you're Saddam, the Americans weren't serious. So Saddam, coming up until 1990, has an experience where weapons of mass destruction have saved him, saved his regime. And the external world is, hasn't really expressed a heck of a lot of opposition to that. In 1990, Saddam made roughly every 10 years he made a major miscalculation. But in 1990, he is still suffering from the economic consequences of the war with Iran. There's large amounts of debt that is not being forgiven. The countries in the Gulf region, countries whom he saw as having benefited by his defeat of the Persians, as he would describe it, were then not relieving his economic constraints. And he saw that as a form of aggression. And again, I had long discussions with Tariq Aziz and others, senior members of Saddam's regime, and they would say this to me, but it really wouldn't resonate, because in my head, and throughout my discussion in this book, a lot of this is a process of realizing your own assumptions by contrast with someone else's. And, in my head, an economic thing, if somebody's keeping the prices of oil down and it's hurting you, that's not like war. War is something where things blow up. That's not necessarily the case in the mindset in the Baghdad regime. From Saddam's perspective, they were committing aggression against Iraq, and I don't think we ever really appreciated that at the time, certainly. And then in the summer of 1990, bear in mind just a couple things which had happened. Saddam had launched a few Scud missiles, testing chemical weapons on them. He was obviously moving forces down to be close to the Kuwaiti border. He'd been visited by very senior Americans, Senator Dole and Rumsfeld at the time. He'd been in receipt of a letter from the first President Bush congratulating him on his another new year in office and so forth. So and he'd had this experience throughout the 1980s where the United States was basically the word was tilting towards him, but supporting him. he had a meeting with our ambassador at the time, April Glaspie, and what he heard from that was that if he did something with respect to Kuwait, it would be seen in the context of an Arab problem, and the Arabs should sort this out themselves. And I think, he threw out a flyer, in a sense, and said, well, if we did do this, and, if America were forced to respond, they'd probably launch rockets and drop bombs, which was something that's one level of response. If you had been Saddam's intelligence analyst at the time, and Saddam asked you, and say, hey, what do you reckon the Americans would do if we moved into this place that thinks it's a country? It's actually in the 19th province of Iraq, but and took back the oil which belongs to us. What do you reckon the Americans would do? Well, in the context of the time, an Iraqi analyst would say, well, I don't know, they might launch some bombs and rockets and squeal in the Security Council. No Iraqi analyst, I doubt any American analyst at that time would have said, if you do that, boss, hundreds of thousands of troops are going to be deployed to Saudi Arabia. They're going to have air wings and aircraft carriers and they're going to put people on the ground. That was not that was not in the cards. What Saddam had failed to appreciate, and I think, was that the world had changed again. Like the change of the world in '79 and '80, in 1990, the Berlin Wall had fallen down. The focus of all American defense policy, the NATO-Warsaw Pact balance, which has been described as that was the lock and key under which American forces were kept, because that dominated all of our defense planning. All of a sudden, that was free. People were looking for opportunities to demonstrate the new world order, and lo and behold, Saddam walks right into that. In a sense, he creates an opportunity where the United States can stand on principle, where Secretary Baker and Edward Shevardnadze can demonstrate that the New World Order is a place where the United States and Russia can cooperate on common international goals. Well, you can kind of understand from Saddam's perspective that he didn't understand that or appreciate that at the time, and he made his yet another major mistake. And it was a mistake that led to another case where he figured that weapons of mass destruction were quite useful and quite important, because in the ensuing war, where he was expelled from Kuwait, he had loaded, he had dispersed, and he had pre-delegated the authority to use chemical and biological weapons. We learned this later in 1995, but I asked them subsequently, I said, well, why didn't you use them? And I got the answer that I expected, which was that, in essence, Saddam thought he'd be toast. That there was a meeting before the 1991 war between Secretary Baker and Tariq Aziz in Geneva, where part of the message which was conveyed to the Iraqis was, by the way, if you use unconventional weapons, it will be regime ending. And they understood that. And in the same conversation, the Iraqis then, after having answered that, then they said, well, let me ask you a question, Mr. Diller. I said, so why didn't you go to Baghdad? I said, well, that was not part of the mandate. The mandate was to expel Iraq from Kuwait. And they said, yeah, sure. I'd say that too if I were you, in essence what they're saying. But what they believed firmly was that the fact that they had these weapons, they dispersed them and they pre-delegated the authority to use them, was well known to us, and that it deterred the United States from going into Iraq in 1991. So, this is background which, I'm trying to explain the mindset and biases from Saddam. He's got two cases where weapons of mass destruction have saved his regime. Then from 1991 to 1998, there is this process where the United Nations is obligated to verify that Iraq has dismantled and is not reconstituting its weapons of mass destruction. This was the result of the ceasefire resolution passed in the spring of 1991, which ended the war. This was a new experience. I hasten to add that this was not arms control. A lot of the things involved in it look like arms control. There's inspectors and things like that. But it was coercive disarmament. And the analog is the Versailles Treaty, where coercive disarmament was embedded in the obligations that Germany was meant to follow, and that there were prices to be paid if they did not. So, Iraq was in a circumstance where it could not get sanctions lifted unless it was verifiably found to be compliant with these disarmament provisions. The UNSCOM, the body created to monitor and affect this from the Security Council, began in 1991 with a group of people who were brought from a range of different countries, led by Litvak, a very talented Swedish diplomat. And a couple things happened right away. Saddam took a decision, it turns out, in April of 1991. Said, okay, look, give these guys the obvious. We got to get out of these sanctions. So do what we need to do to get out of the sanctions, but give them the obvious stuff. And the judgment was that a bunch of these fuzzy-headed UNSCOM people, what the hell are they going to do? They'll be around for a few months, and then, that'll be that, and, we'll get on with business. The inspectors went in, and Saddam got a very quick and early lesson of two parts. One is these inspectors could be pretty annoying in terms of where they wanted to go. And that a bit surprising. But so he blocked them. But then he got the more important lesson. And, there's a very early blockage that was, quite contrary to all the written laws in the resolution. And the Security Council took the following action. It deployed Hans Blix and Rolf Akeas to Baghdad to talk to them. Now, if you're Saddam Hussein, a guy who, has a fine sense of force, and you do something which is blatantly contrary to resolution, and what happens, the Security Council, they don't send cruise missiles, they send 2 Swedes. That doesn't, this is not regime threatening. So, very early on, Saddam gets this lesson. And so what happened, to try to compress this a bit, is, over the course of, 5 years, there's a back and forth between the Security Council and Iraq, and between the inspectors in Iraq, where gradually, the full story is peeled away. But it happens in such a fashion that mindsets and biases are reinforced both on the Baghdad side and on the Washington side, where this pattern of deceit and only forced revelation reinforces a view on the American side and in the American intelligence community that Saddam will always have something to hide. Now, from Saddam's perspective, he's got this going on, which is done in sort of the UN context, but also out there is the American very vocal policy of regime change. Now, it's vocalized, not much is done about it, but if you're in Saddam's shoes, they say, well, and I was asked this question regularly, again, being one of the few Americans that they could speak to, say, well, if we do comply with all this stuff, is Washington really going to agree to lift the sanctions? And, the glib answer I'd give at the time is, well, there's one way to find out. But that was a constant challenge which they had to wrestle with, and different members of the regime would argue different ways at different times. Frankly, I was astonished that Iraq cooperated with the inspections as long as they did. From Saddam's perspective, and again, he was looking at power and force and interests, in that region, as it appeared logical to him. They basically calculated, said, well, look, the Americans are, they're still sore about Kuwait. All right, I'm not quite sure why they're so upset about it, but okay. over the course of some period of time, they'll get over it. And they'll realize that it is in their interest to deal with Baghdad, because Baghdad, you know, Iraqis are engineers, they're secular, they're the people with real energy, they do stuff, you know, not just these, you know, characters in the Gulf who by the accident of birth were born on a pot of oil. I mean, I'm characterizing the Iraqi perspective, but you know, from their view, it was a natural for the United States to come to terms with Baghdad. And that, you know, slowly eroded over time because, you know, by 1998, you know, Tariq Aziz would say, listen, you know, it's pretty clear now that we can have inspections with, or we can have sanctions with inspectors, or we can have sanctions without inspectors. And they just said, you know, we'll take the other path. So all this is by way of laying out the mindsets and biases, which gets us, you know, really through the end of the Clinton administration. And I want to make one other point about that period, and that is that the regime, with this view of that the United States, you know, really ought to recognize it has a coincidence of interest with Iraq. It kept, you know, coming to me and others saying, look, what do we have to do to talk to you guys? We'll be your best friend in the region, bar none. We'll do whatever you want. We'll help you with Islamic, radical Islamic terrorism. We'll help you find the bombers of the World Trade Center, the first World Trade Center bombing. They offered all kinds of things. We'll help you with the, with the Middle East peace process. If you need a place to have Palestinians come, we'll help you with that. And, you know, to which I would always point to the picture on the wall, which was Saddam. And they just did not understand the internal dynamics in Washington that made that an impossible thing to do. It was perfectly logical from their perspective, but it was impossible in the Washington context. One other thing on this, which in 1998, I happened to be in Baghdad when Monica Lewinsky broke, and I teach incoming intelligence analysts, you know, some of the, you know, lessons learned, quote unquote, from the Iraqi experience, and I make a point of it. You know, context is important, and a lot of these characters don't remember who Monica Lewinsky was. But I happened to be in Baghdad, and supposedly we were supposed to be talking about chemical weapons and stuff. They didn't want, you know, we want to know about this Monica Lewinsky thing, because that just didn't compute for them. I mean, it just did not compute. But basically what they did understand, there was a sense of weakness. They could get that. So, some intern, how can that tie up in knots the last superpower? They didn't understand how that worked, but they did understand that there was weakness. And that contributed to their decision process throughout 1998, and also contributed to the conclusion, well, you know, we can have sanctions with inspectors or have sanctions without. Also contributing to that that trend in their thinking was the advice they were getting from the Russians and French. So at the end of 1998, the inspections ended. And the Iraqi ambassador said to me at the time, he said, you know, there was this 4-day bombing period in December, which some wags had called the impeachment bombing. But they basically said, you know, if we had known that was all you were going to do, we would have ended this inspection process a long time ago. Throughout that ensuing couple of years, then, you know, not much happened in the Security Council. Certainly Iraq wasn't permitting inspectors to back in. And that, again, you know, reinforced Saddam's mindset was that, hey, these inspections, they're going to crumble. He was very astute in making use of the oil for food program. You know, the UN, concerned about the plight of the Iraqi people, said, okay, you can export oil, but only in exchange for things which, you know, are appropriate. But Saddam derived enormous leverage because while the checkbook was controlled by the UN, in essence, the name that was filled in on the check was controlled by Iraq. And if there was a way of deriving leverage, I mean, Saddam was a genius at doing this stuff, and he dispersed contracts based on, you know, how helpful people were to him, and he was doing very well. The Baghdad International Fair in 1999 and 2000, and it was teeming with Western business people. Countries were falling over themselves to establish relationships with Iraq. The message he was getting was, he was he was back. His next cataclysmic mistake, though, was in not appreciating the importance of 9/11. At the end of the Clinton administration, Saddam was on a roll in a sense. The incoming Bush administration was trying to review what to do with Iraq. It was quite clear at that time sanctions were crumbling. You may recall there was a proposal that came out of the State Department. Colin Powell and company were proposing something called smart sanctions. So instead of having sanctions with a presumption of denial, in other words, things were permitted to go into Iraq only by exception, there was going to be the obverse, which was that if something were on an explicit list of things that were thought to be dual use that could be used in a weapons program, then it was presumed to go in. And the Iraqis, again, understood that for what it was, which was a major retreat, but it was a way of kind of sustaining sanctions at least a little bit longer. So the United States at that point in time really had, three kind of options. It could continue to try to band-aid as long as possible the mechanism for containment, which was sanctions through the UN. Sanctions which were explicitly tied to weapons of mass destruction and the findings about them. Or, conceivably, it could begin a dialogue with Iraq in some fashion. I mean, logically, you could imagine a dialogue which may have as its ultimate purpose the regime change. But certainly in the Clinton administration, and probably also in the Bush administration, that was not a possible option in the Washington environment. And so the third option becomes, okay, well, if you're serious about regime change, you've really got to do something. And while those ideas were sort of cast about in the period up until 9/11, it was really only after 9/11 that people, had their concentration, really focused on that. And I think President Bush made, in my view, a defensible decision that it was unacceptable to the strategic interest of the United States to have Saddam in charge of this piece of geography. That was dangerous. It is my view that virtually every step to implement that was a monumental mistake. But what happened was in late 2001 and early 2002, this discussion was going on, and in essence, there was a view that said, look, we don't have to go along. We can do this with international participation if we go through the UN. This is a view that Prime Minister Blair and Secretary Powell espoused. But the premise in that was that, again, it linked the Saddam regime to these resolutions related to weapons of mass destruction. And there was a sense that there's no way Saddam could comply with these resolutions. So therefore, if we drive this issue through the UN Security Council, at the end of the day, you'll get what you want, but you'll get it with a consensus of the international community. Now, if someone had, asked UNSCOM inspectors about this, they would have said, well, this WMD, we've gone pretty far down that road, and I think it's a fair statement to say that UNSCOM inspectors generally, and they are quite individual, and but the view was that they had some probably retained some capability. My personal view is that some missiles and the ability to reconstitute chemical and biological weapons pretty quickly. But I think virtually every UNSCOM alumni would have said, well, it's going to be damn hard to prove that and to show it, because that's what we've been doing for several years. And to demonstrably show that, very tough. So we wind up in a position where the policy is tied, again, to WMD. And I don't think the decision was made in terms necessarily of WMD. The other point I guess I would make, and I can treat a lot of other things in questions, but in the period leading up to the war, once the decision had been made on, they were really going to do something about regime change, I think that Well, the short statement would be that the administration chose to believe and use the intelligence community assessments on WMD, which turned out to be largely wrong. The administration chose not to use and not to believe the CIA judgments about the internal dynamics in Iraq. It happened that because I spent most of the 90s working with these characters, I knew a lot of Iraqis in Iraq. And I didn't fully appreciate it at the time, but that was probably that was rather rare knowledge, it turns out, within Washington. There was a great deal of particularly in OSD, to point a finger in particular, they depended a lot on information from external Iraqis who were not connected in any way that I could figure out to Iraqis in Iraq. And it was my hypothesis at the time that if it was entirely possible to be in touch with Iraqis, senior Iraqis in each ministry. And if we had executed a strategy where we went to those individuals and said, keep the lights on, keep things running, we're going to come in and we will sort out the leadership on a case-by-case basis once we're in Baghdad, I think we would have avoided a lot of the problems that we had. However, the CIA was prohibited from doing any work with respect to the post-conflict governance. In terms of, before the war, there was authorization for the CIA to do many things, sabotage, fiddling around with the economics and so forth, but the role of doing pre-war preparatory work for post-war governance was blocked. And to my way of thinking, we are at a place now in Iraq, just having gone through some elections which were, I think, generally considered to be successful. We're at a place now where we could have been in early 2004 without the wasted 4 years and thousands of people killed. But that's, in a sense, that's hindsight. But I do go through in my book a little bit of the work that I was doing and before the war that I think could have, which substantiates that case a bit. And I would just point to one last element of that. That people look at the oil ministry. The oil ministry was protected during the conflict. After the conflict, there were senior oil ministry people who were identified, and we knew, and we talked to them quite early. The oil ministry survived the transition pretty well, and I think that could have been replicated. To me, that's an existence theorem for what could have happened across the board. Anyway, let me just stop there. And
thank you very much, Rob.
Hale, thank you very much for inviting me to be a discussant today. Charles, welcome back to the Wilson Center. I strongly commend this book to you. It is elegantly written. It is a page-turner. It's a detective story, but where you know the ending. I'd like to begin, though, by paying tribute to Charles and his 26 years of service in the U.S. government. This book, he didn't mention it, but it opens with the IED attack on a convoy that he was part of in Baghdad. And it closes with him attending the memorial service for the members of the Kansas National Guard who were killed. They were part of the security detail. It ends with his participation in the memorial service for those servicemen. So as much as this is an academic institution, we can have a discussion about the issues raised in this book. This ain't social science. This has had the costs and the legacy that Charles brilliantly details in the book. In the preface of it, Charles writes, "What we learned from Iraq is broadly applicable to other circumstances. Policymakers, intelligence analysts, and citizens will, I hope, extrapolate many conclusions beyond what I've sketched here." Well, I'd like to start that process of extrapolation, and my comments will focus on the challenges the United States now confronts with other hard cases and how the Iraq experience can shed light on how we deal with the current hard cases that the Obama administration finds in their inbox as they take office. This book brilliantly elucidates how a flawed image of the adversary was translated into a flawed strategy. That is the one point that comes through in this book more loudly than anything else, and is the point that I would like to emphasize. Flawed image of the adversary translated into a flawed strategy. The United States' major foreign policy failures have arisen either from a flawed analysis of the target state, or from policymakers ignoring sound target state analysis and instead devising strategies on the basis of some ideological predilection or even a vain hope. A generation ago, we paid the price in Vietnam. Today, we are paying it in Iraq. Now, the term target state analysis, social science sounding term, has several synonyms: political personality, strategic culture, strategic personality. All of these terms encompass the long-term geographical, historical, and cultural forces that uniquely shape each state's worldview and calculus of decision-making. Some factors are structural and therefore durable, such as geography and ethnic composition. Other factors are idiosyncratic and transient because they derive from the particular regime in power. And analytically, one must distinguish between what I would call regime generic factors and regime specific factors. A regime generic factor pertaining to any regime in power in Baghdad is that Iraq is contiguous to Iran and is about 1/3 the size in population. Any government in Baghdad will have to address that immutable kind of reality. At the same time, as one looks at the issues that were central to Charles Dulfer's mission when he headed the Iraq Survey Group, Iraq had active WMD, including nuclear programs. So when asked the question, were Iraq's programs purely the product of Saddam Hussein's megalomania, and therefore specific to the Saddam Hussein regime, or did they reflect impulses that any Iraqi government of whatever composition might well flirt with, given the structural factors in play? That's analytically in play as a question. But the point I'd like to emphasize here, in the context of flawed image yielding flawed strategy, is the point that what I just described as target state analysis creates the critical threshold assumption for strategy formulation. Think of George Kennan's legendary X article in Foreign Affairs in 1947. It was not titled Containment: A New Strategy for Dealing with the Soviet Union. The title of the article was tellingly The Sources of Soviet Conduct. Kennan's genius as the leading Russia-Soviet watcher in the US government was to offer a concept of societal change for the Soviet Union, which was also a prophecy about how the Cold War could end. George Kennan's X article argued that the United States should engage in balancing, kind of a classic realist response to the rise of Soviet power, and allow the internal contradictions of the Soviet society to play out, and thus prophesizing how the Cold War might end. This process came to fruition in the Gorbachev era, where you had essentially regime change through evolution. But my point in this context was, when we discuss strategies in Washington, they are premised on concepts of societal change for the particular state in question. And often these concepts are implicit, unarticulated, not the product of sound analysis, but often vain hope or some ideological predilection. Two cases. North Korea. In 2002, the then Deputy Secretary of Defense said, North Korea is teetering. Now, that was a judgment about the state of stability in North Korea. If, as a threshold assumption, your conclusion is that the North Korean regime is teetering, that then fed into the preferred strategy of the Bush administration at that time, which was a squeeze strategy. Let's squeeze the bastards. Let's enlist China through comprehensive containment, and if they are indeed teetering, we can bring about a collapse of the regime, and we'll solve the nonproliferation problem in North Korea, because this regime will not exist any longer. And the Bush administration very much tied threat to the character of particular regimes, and hence their emphasis on regime change. Or in the Iranian context today, what is the current concept of societal change for Iran? Most experts point to a vibrant, although increasingly repressed, civil society in Iran. They view that as the most likely agent of change. And that analysis leads some analysts to argue, I think highly controversially, that a strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure could be essentially the starting gun of a counter-revolution against the regime. That could lead to another one of these trillion-dollar social science experiments, a threshold assumption about the status of internal politics in Iran and how an American action might be able to precipitate some type of change, or less dramatically than an airstrike on Natanz and the associated infrastructure, even the program to have the U.S. government support NGOs in Iran directly. It feeds into this notion that the United States can play upon the civil society as the agent of change to promote the desired outcome. Now, my point here is not to push any particular policy line, but rather, in a role I think fitting to an institution like the Wilson Center, to just be aware of this dynamic and to try to dissect it so that strategy formulation in Washington can be better served through sound analysis of precisely the type that Charles performs in this book and was doing when he was on the job, of where is the target state coming from? Kind of, what keeps this regime in power? What are potential sources of leverage for the United States? And that sound analysis, and Charles is quite modest in not calling himself an Iraq expert, but if you read that book, you see profound insight and knowledge kind of reflected in it. It was precisely that was in evidence in Washington in the lead up to the war in Iraq, but was largely disregarded, particularly in the context of how the post-war period would unfold. Charles writes, Americans did not understand Iraq. This failure led to flawed assessments at key points. End of the Iran-Iraq War, a National Security Council study that concluded that in the wake of the Iran-Iraq War, that Saddam would be quiescent, that he was exhausted by the Iran-Iraq War, and that we could predict a quiescent regional environment with Saddam Hussein. A year later, he invaded Kuwait. The end of the Gulf War. There was an initial belief, at least in looking at the Bush Scowcroft memoir, sense that Saddam's own cronies would oust him in the aftermath of the debacle of having been humiliated in Kuwait. Later, during the period of general sanctions, to coerce Saddam's compliance with Security Council resolutions, the period that Charles spent extensively in Iraq, there was a sense, well, maybe these sanctions will squeeze to the point that there'll be some type of there'll be a coup. We'll wake up some morning to a coup where some pressure will come to fruition. Or, I think most disastrously, in 2003, after the toppling of Saddam Hussein, this vain hope and ideological belief that the United States could fly in on a C-19 Iraqi exiles who were knew more about the Dorchester Hotel in London than about contemporary Iraq, and somehow install them as a successor government. Across this history, tortured history, one sees flawed assessments leading to failed policies. The failure to deter Saddam from invading Kuwait, the failure to coerce him to pull out of Kuwait, the failure during the sanctions regime to coerce Saddam to come into compliance with Security Council resolutions. Now, to be sure, these flaws and misperceptions were on both sides. Saddam Hussein certainly misperceived the United States, and I think it's interesting, and the Iraq Survey Group is, on this issue of target state, it is such a resource and such a not used nearly as much as it should be. It's a brilliantly valuable tool. But one of the points coming through this is, before the invasion of we view events like April Glaspie, our ambassador, going to visit Saddam Hussein and delivering kind of her talking points, and that's viewed as in the policy analysis as a failure of American deterrent policy, much like when Dean Acheson gave the defense perimeter speech in late 1940s, 1949, and excluded South Korea. That Cold War historians have pointed to as a reason why Stalin green-lighted the invasion on South Korea. Similarly, the failure of the United States to explicitly state that any territorial shift in Kuwait would be unacceptable to the United States is in Washington viewed as a deterrence failure and in this case, the crafting of the talking points for that meeting in July 1990 with Saddam Hussein. But what's revealed in this book is that Saddam had decided before that meeting even occurred to go into Kuwait, and he thought that the United States was casualty averse because of the U.S. experience in Vietnam. And there's an ironic and chilling exchange that Charles has with an Iraqi official after the toppling of Saddam Hussein, who said, "Boy, we really misjudged you. You guys, we thought you were risk averse and casualty averse all along. You had never implemented this strategy of blowing up the Iraqi army and de-Baathifying the country if you were really risk averse, because you created the insurgency. That's not a casualty risk aversion. Boy, did we misjudge you." That's sort of some of the insightful and occasionally sort of dark humor that sort of intrudes in this volume. The failure to uncover WMD stocks in Iraq pose a conundrum about Saddam's actions and the strategic motivations in the lead up to the 2003 war. He didn't have anything. Charles went to Iraq as part of this Iraq survey group, as he puts it, not to find a WMD, but to find the truth. The truth was Saddam did not have stocks. And begs the question, why didn't he just come clean? If he didn't have anything, why didn't he just come clean? Because Iraq had been essentially disarmed over the 8-year period of UNSCOM's operations. And why didn't he just agree to essentially terms that Gaddafi later in 2003, in December 2003, accepted? And that would have undermined the Bush administration's primary rationale for the war. Again, this volume, building on the work of the Iraq Survey Group, sheds light on this question. Saddam cultivated ambiguity about his WMD programs with the United States, with his own officials. He believed ambiguity had strategic utility, that it could have an important deterrent effect on adversaries. Charles cited the historical case. They believed they deterred a march on Baghdad in 1991 because of their chemical stocks. One of his generals called this cultivation of ambiguity deterrence by doubt. Ironically, the ambiguity about Iraq's WMD capabilities that Saddam cultivated to retain this strategic deterrent became the basis for the U.S. military action that toppled his regime. How am I doing on time? Do I have a couple of minutes? Okay.
Couple of minutes and then.
In 2003, I've alluded to it, another important non-proliferation precedent was set. Iraq was non-proliferation through coercive disarmament that Charles described, what someone referred to as uncooperative threat reduction. In December 2003, one had a contrasting case in Libya where Gaddafi gave it up. And of course, the Bush administration in 2003 claimed Libya as a dividend of the Iraq war, that Gaddafi had been scared straight. But I think in the evidence, and Gaddafi's son has spoken about this, what was clear was that Iraq may have certainly caught their attention and showed how the United States, its attitude towards proliferation in a post-9/11 world. But what sealed the deal with Gaddafi was a tacit but clear assurance that the United States would fall off of regime change as an objective if Gaddafi came clean. That was the crux of the deal. And in dealing with North Korea and Iran, these hard cases that are on the current agenda, the Obama administration, inheriting from the Bush administration, I would say the Bush administration was caught between precedents in the second administration. On the one hand, they couldn't replicate Iraq for all the reasons, and they weren't, as Charles details, the Bush administration was not prepared to take yes for an answer, even if they did give it up, which they weren't likely to do. And on the other hand, the Bush administration was unprepared to offer the Libya deal, the crux of which was the security assurance. They were caught between the Iraq and the Libya precedents. And at the core of this was this mixed message over whether, and I'm wrapping up here, Hala, over whether the U.S. policy objective was to change the regime or to change its behavior. And the Obama administration has come to office having clarified that message, and it's come out of the mouth of the President of the United States, and is therefore has credibility in a way that the Bush administration, with its legacy, never clarified it. And I think that positions the Obama administration to, even though the proliferation problems in Iran and North Korea are worse than they were, more advanced than they were 8 years ago, to tee up what I would call a structured choice with a real upside and a more credible downside for Iran and North Korea, having clarified what the U.S. objective is. Does this ensure a successful outcome? No, but it's the prerequisite for testing the intentions of Iran and North Korea. And to circle back now to my starting point, all of this is premised on avoiding the profound flaw that Charles' book brilliantly elucidates, of how a flawed image of the adversary fed into illusory and flawed strategies. And we have to get it right with Iran and North Korea in terms of how we perceive the character of the regime and the threat they pose, and therefore translate that sound analysis of the target state into a potential, hopefully effective strategy in dealing with the challenges they pose. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much. We are going to open the floor now. Judith, please. Just wait a second for the mic. They're just getting it to you. Please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I ask Charles a question, just a quick word to you, Rob. You cited a lot of the mistakes we've made, and it could fill volumes, and hopefully somebody will write those volumes. But there was also a target of opportunity that was there were many, but I want to cite one here. After the first Gulf War in 1990, the United States had more power, influence, and the possibility of getting things done in the Middle East than in previously recorded history or ever again. We probably now have less influence than we've ever had. And that opportunity by the first Bush administration, unfortunately, they were so happy they only killed 45 people. Iraq was out of Kuwait, and they went home, and it was over. Had there been some creative diplomacy at that time, we never would have gotten to where we are with Iran, in the Arab-Israeli, Lebanon, even with Iraq. So I think that when we look at mistakes, we should also think about places where we failed to act when we had extraordinary opportunities to actually achieve something. So Charles, have we learned anything? What Rob ended with, we absolutely have to get it right in Iran. And the U.S. has a very hard problem. Though we are a country of foreigners as a nation, we don't really like foreigners, and we don't do too well with non-Judeo-Western Christian cultures. We don't understand them. We're scared of them. Do you think that the agency in particular has changed its way of doing business in a way that they would be more open to the realities? And God knows Iran is a much more complicated society than Iraq.
First, I should say, Judith, thank you very much for all the support you've given me over the years, and you provided a refuge for me to come to at a certain point in my career. Lessons learned, one of the lessons, I think, is that, it is very odd that at a point in time I was the only senior American who knew any of these characters in Baghdad. We paid an enormous price for not having an embassy there. The decision to break off relations, our time frame for making decisions is very compressed. We're driven by election cycles, budget cycles, news cycles, and that is very different from many other countries, particularly a country like Saddam's Iraq or even Iran. So we'll make a decision, let's break off relations, but that we paid a long-term price for that. Just the general understanding of Iraqis and what motivated them and what was going on, that didn't exist in Washington in 2002 and 2003 when the decisions about the war were made. So I guess with respect to Iran, I know it sends a signal that perhaps you don't want to send, but having people who live and work in Tehran, there's a huge benefit to that, even if it's your goal to replace the regime. The Iraqis after the war came to me and they would say, listen, if wasn't there a more logical way of getting rid of Saddam through in essence, covert action. And, they, of course, look at the last superpowers having all kinds of talents and knowledge and things that, if you live in Washington, it's obvious. They think we're smart. But it is an important fact. I mean, they think the CIA knows everything. So they will behave in a way where they assume that we knew that Iraq had gotten rid of the WMD. And I'm sure Tehran believes that we know more about their weapons program than probably we really do. This gets complicated, and if you're talking to intelligence analysts, when you're trying to assess the behavior of that which you're looking at, you have to understand the behavior you're observing is driven by how they understand our actions. I mean, this, insanity lies too far down this path. But I guess one thing is that, to the extent that we can get, official Americans in contact with real Iranians or North Koreans, that you can't lose there. The other thing, with respect to the CIA, I tend to be defensive of the CIA. And I put my cards on the table. They get jerked around a lot, but everybody's objectives change every once in a while. One of the messages I give to incoming officers is, bear in mind whatever you do today is going to be judged by standards you can't anticipate in the future. There's going to be some new set of objectives and ideals and everything else. So, while today is, whatever it is, get the job done, that's good. But, the politicians are going to change. That's a dynamic which we'll never fix. And just as there's it's nice to say that there should be a break between, a firewall between policymakers and intelligence. It's nice, but it doesn't work in the real world. You need interaction between policymakers and the intelligence community. And with respect to Iran, it is my experience that people are working to get on the ground. I think there is a lot of lessons which have been drawn from the Iraq case. These are not hermetically sealed environments, and I often said to people even in the late 90s and early 2000s about Iraq, if you want to know about Iraq, just go to your doctor out in Fairfax County. Odds are this guy, and I had cases where they knew what was going on in RCC meetings, well before anybody in the U.S. intelligence community. So if you want to know what's going on in Iran, you can go to L.A. You learn a lot in L.A. about Tehran. Well, yeah, but I mean, it is just a function of the way our government works, where there's an agreed set of data, like it's some Scrabble puzzle, and you get so many letters, and those are the agreed facts. You need to be able to expand that a bit and allow for people who have a tactile feel for it. And one further point on improvements, I think, which I believe, well, I don't know, it may revert to form, but to the extent that you can get analysts, more analysts in the field, so that they do not live, and see the universe through a computer screen. It's like Plato's cave. I have used as a sight gag in teaching some of these new analysts. I'll get a computer screen and say there's nothing in there, and then I'll get a mallet and beat the living daylights out of it. It's very difficult for those flat screens, but there's nothing in there. But that's what they do. They stare at this thing, and they don't have that tactile feel and the separation between, operations officers who do tend to spend time in the field, but their incentives are to get scalps, meaning, sources and stuff, without understanding necessarily the overall. And I'm simplifying this. If there are officers here, I'm simplifying, and I know I am. But to the extent that you can shorten the distance between collection and analysis, that's all to the good. And what I have observed with respect to Iran, I think they're headed down that path. That's irrespective of the policy, however.
Charles, going to LA talking to the Iranian community is like going to Chalabi and talking to him.
Well,
I think that, and then you are very critical of going to Chalabi and talking to him. Yes, please. Yes, sure.
My name is Stephen Short. I can't resist asking this question. In Pakistan, we've never ceased to have people on the ground, but is, in your opinion, our knowledge of Pakistan's weaponry and their willingness to export any more sophisticated or on target than it has been with North Korea, Iraq, and Iran?
That's straying a little bit from what I would really claim to be my area of expertise, but from my experience with Iraq, I'd say certainly we know a heck of a lot more about Pakistan than Iraq. And if we're going to make mistakes in Pakistan, they'll be very different mistakes. The access there, has been very good, I think. And I make a glib statement here, and I don't think it's too glib, but the American government, I've come to a conclusion, which kind of comes out in this book, is that the number of things we can do is actually getting smaller. And that's one lesson for, I think, any incoming administration. I mean, just the number of things that we can do is shrinking. Even if our wisdom were to grow and we knew exactly what we wanted to do, for example, as a thought experiment, if you wanted to maneuver Saddam out without going to war, each of us could, sit in our office and say, well, if we do this, we could pretend to get close to him, and then, we could either maneuver him out, kill him, or whatever. But the reality in Washington is we couldn't do that. And we seem to be able to do three things. We can, throw money at a problem. We throw lots of money at a problem. We can create new bureaucracies, or we can blow things up. And of those three tools, the only one which has become more refined in the last couple of decades is the ability to blow things up. We've got these predator strikes now, which are pretty neat. I mean, that's probably the wrong term, but it's we can blow things up with more precision. But I'm not sure, that doesn't, if you're trying to do, remove a brain tumor, don't come to the U.S. government. We don't do brain surgery. I mean, but that's one of the lessons.
There is a passage in your book when an Iraqi comes to you and asks you, why do Americans like to blow up buildings? And then you start talking about it. What was the perception they got? This is a lesson I teach in the intelligence community, but where you've got to know your assumptions. And there are, we've got Windows 2000 in our brains, and we don't even know that. And that shaped what we saw. I will ask, an analyst, I say, well, look, can you see something that you don't have a word for? Now you can go down some discussion of cognition and stuff, but to someone, can you see something that you don't have a word for? Now, if you're somebody in the most conflict you have seen is a fight in a hockey game or something, then there are certain things that you won't see because you don't have words for them. And the example I use is exactly this, with a fellow named Amir Rashid, who the guy came to know quite well in the years as an UNSCOM inspector. I saw him at OPEC meetings where he was, in grand style in Vienna, and then after the conflict, when we were both looking pretty scruffy in a tent, and he was in detention. But at an earlier point in time, we had this inspection of palaces, which this was in 1998, which is it's almost before the internet, so no one remembers it. But there was a big deal, and we were standing in front of what was a Republican palace at the time, and the Iraqis had built a wall, a freestanding wall, about, 15 feet tall, 50 feet long, and it was just a wall, and kind of just in front of the door of this palace. And so I asked Amir Rashid, I said, Amir, what's with the wall? He goes, oh, well, Mr. Delver, we understand how your cruise missiles work. You've fired cruise missiles, and some of them don't go off, and we give them to the Russians, and they take them apart, and they tell us how they work, and blah, blah, blah. And we know that you take pictures, and they home in on pictures. So we figure if we build this wall, it'll disrupt the picture. It'll disrupt the image. The photons, the pixels will be reorganized. And by the way, if the cruise missile flies this way, it might hit the wall and then pre-detonate. So I said, that sounds pretty good to me. And then he asked me a question. He goes, Mr. Delphin, may I ask you a question? And he says, why do you blow up buildings? And no one ever asked me that before. Why do we blow up buildings? And I was like gobsmacked. And I gave him a wise-ass answer. I said, well, I'm an American. It's in our genes. That's what we do. We blow up buildings. But it highlighted an assumption that our entire national security complex is designed on, we take pictures from satellites of rooftops. We say, oh, this is a building. And some analyst says, oh, this building does, it does this or it does that or something. And then that gets built into some, assessment of enemy capabilities. And when somebody decides they want to degrade an enemy's capabilities, they blow up buildings. Now, if you're an Iraqi, and Saddam made this point, and Saddam was,
I have to be careful because it sounds like I have, Saddam was an interesting guy. You can't, it's not right to say too many positive things about him, but that guy, he was a smart guy. But, if you're an Iraqi and you say, okay, if you've got something you care about, whatever you do, don't put it in a building. And they didn't. And so, they would take a bunch of 155 millimeter chemical rounds, they'd put it out in the field. And then we'd never see it. And it was just, I'm droning on, but knowing your assumptions is important.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I'm Howard Wiarda from CSIS and the Wilson Center. I'd like to build on Bob Litvak's argument that from Charles's book, that flawed images of the country that we deal with leads to bad and failed policies. And I want to suggest with Charles and Haley and Judy Kipper and Robin Wright and others in the room who've written about this for 30 years, that this is generalizable to many other societies besides Iraq. That is, we're weak on languages, we're weak on culture, we're weak on area studies. We very often, in diverse areas of the world, don't understand empathetically and without ethnocentrism the countries that we're dealing with. So the question after this comment actually goes back to Bob Litvak rather than Charles this time, which is, in addition to many other reasons that we could think of for this, do you think the field of international relations itself is partially responsible? Because it seems to me that IR has increasingly gone in the direction of building complex mathematical models that render into irrelevance the notion of understanding the countries that we actually have to deal with. And I wonder if you might, or maybe Charles, comment on this proposition, please.
I'd be happy to, and we actually have a card-carrying political scientist or two in the audience. We can jump them after this meeting or something, because they too have a lot to answer for. But just, I was reminded of a phrase. I had a shorter period of period in government of the Charles. I was on the National Security Council staff, and I remember one of the seasoned veterans just saying, "It ain't as easy as it looks." I mean, it's easy to sit on the banks of the Charles River or in the Woodrow Wilson Center and sort of. I did focus on the flaws, and I didn't mention the opportunities. But it's hard to get some of these things right. I mean, the Wilson Center has all these marvelous regional programs, but sometimes the regional experts can get it wrong. In July 1990, a lot of the regional experts were arguing that the Kuwaitis would just do what they did in these contexts and just add a zero to the check, and Saddam would back off. And it was the logisticians at the CIA who said, hey, this looks like bridging equipment. They're moving stuff. These were not regional experts on South, but they just said, if you're going to do an invasion, this was what an invasion looks like. They're moving all this out. So that's not to dismiss regional expertise, but that also has its own set of issues there. I think that we've talked about the problem of perceptions, and that they're misperceptions kind of working on on both sides in terms of how the Saddam Hussein regime kind of fundamentally misperceived a lot of the American actions. I think this book also. At the time when we're debating treatment of prisoners, et cetera, it should be mentioned that this book also, I think, offers a model of how a prisoner should be interrogated. The Saddam Hussein interrogation is a model of how it should be done, with an experienced lead interrogator, with Charles and team working in tandem with that individual, without waterboarding, being necessary. I've also written down here kinetic solutions. So yeah, we are prone to kinetic solutions, Charles.
I'm going to take 2 questions. Ambassador Guthrie, please. If you could please wait for the mic, and then David Ottaway next to you, and then.
Thank you. I'd like to hear Charles's answer to Rob's question. Why did Saddam not come clean? Was it possible that he had himself been misled by his people as to the extent of WMD that was still in stock? And by extension, if that could have been true, did the UN, the West, all of us, take too readily the assumption of that the declarations the Iraqis made at the beginning of this process were accurate? Did we test, in other words, the baseline assumption sufficiently? Because when it got to justifying the invasion, the argument was that there are weapons that have not been accounted for. In other words, that the baseline assumption was correct. What do you make of that?
Why don't we take another question so we can get that together? David, please.
Dave Ottaway, a senior scholar here and former Washington Post correspondent. I wanted to ask you something about press coverage, the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, where in retrospect there's a lot of criticism of the American press for totally accepting the Bush administration line that there were indeed weapons of mass destruction still in his hands. And my question is, was there any evidence journalists should have paid attention to, or in your talking with journalists, that would have given us enough credibility to write that Saddam Hussein indeed did not have weapons of mass destruction? Or was it too ambiguous for you and therefore for us to take that tact?
Yes.
In the order they were presented, the question about why didn't Saddam just come clean, in a sense, there is not a simple answer to that, because, you know, Saddam, in some ways, like the rest of us, or at least me, and the more I looked into Saddam, the more I saw some things which I might recognize, but it's not perfectly consistent. I mean, he was quite good at believing and behaving in certain ways which supported mutually exclusive tendencies. And so on the one hand, you know, he did state that he had come clean. On the other hand, he wanted the ambiguity, as Rob, you know, pointed to, that, and there was a great deal of leverage and potency to having ambiguity. He, from his perspective, was greatly concerned in a way that we didn't fully appreciate about Iran. Iran was launching missiles in April, I think it was 2000. They launched about 60 missiles into Iraq. So, and he knew Iran had weapons of mass destruction. So he was deliberately ambiguous, but he did know. Although in October of 2002, there was a kind of a funny meeting of the RCC he had where, you know, in a room kind of like this, and with people around there, but, you know, it had like Saddam here, everybody, a bunch of bobbleheads next to him, you know. But he said,
We take orders from Holland.
yeah, that's right. Well, I used to, I had this small company. I said everything I know about management I learned from Saddam Hussein, and, you know, there's a certain truth to that. But so anyway, he'd read about the British reports. The British had a white paper which said, oh, in 45 minutes the Iraqis can launch chemical weapons, and he read the CIA assessment, all this stuff. And so he turns to his guys and he says, hey, you know, is there something here that, you know, maybe I don't know about? To your point, that maybe he didn't know he had this stuff. And then, of course, they said, oh, no, boss, that would be impossible. But so, you know, it was the nature of his method of leadership where he had to doubt everything that people were telling him. But, you know, I'm just telling you facets of the answer to that question. I can't pin to one thing why he did not do this. There were other aspects of it. One is, you know, for him to admit that he didn't have this stuff, he would lose prestige. Another thing, he was just, you know, he did not behave in ways that we would consider logical. In the lead up to the Gulf War in 1991, you know, I had a conversation with Terry. He said, you know, why didn't you guys just pull out a few thousand troops? That would have, you know, really undermined the coalition's actions to go to war in Kuwait. And Tariq Aziz knew this. And at that point, Tariq Aziz points to the picture on the wall. You know, it was kind of this go figure. I don't know. There isn't a simple, clear answer of why he didn't come completely clear. I think a lot of it was that, you know, there was a sense that people wouldn't believe it anyway. And, you know, Tariq Aziz in 1998 said, "Look, we're sick of being, you know, just dragged along on this inspection stuff. We've given you everything, and their assumption is that we knew that, but that he said, you guys come in for 6 months. We'll give you 6 months. Go anywhere you want. But at the end of 6 months, if the council says, make a call. We're either clean or we're not clean. And if we're not clean, show us why. I mean, they were trying to push that. And so there was this sense that, this conflict's going to go on anyway. On the point about the journalists, the journalists are a lot like intelligence collectors and analysts. I mean, the tasks are pretty much the same. And there was the hypothesis was that Saddam would be crazy not to have weapons of mass destruction. And there's a similar, I think, incentive structure built into the journalistic world as there is in the intelligence world. If you're sitting in a bar in Beirut, and the guy on the stool next to you says, I hear Iraq's got mobile biological weapons lab. He runs back to the station and writes this thing up, and it goes, and it's in a presidential daily brief. If the guy on the bar next to you says, I hear there's no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, goes nowhere. So part of the system that we have to wrestle with in the intelligence community, and presumably journalists as well, in a sense, is how do you account for negative information? I mean, you're going to get a headline because somebody says there's no WMD, and this is the same problem that the Iraqis faced, Tariq Aziz and all these other characters. How do you prove a negative? I mean, they kept coming to us, look, how do we prove that we don't have anything? Short answer is it's hard for me to be critical of the pre-war journalists reporting, which tended to, is seen as echoing the administration's march to war. I mean, you know the terms that but nobody, everybody. I got more calls from journalists who each had their own pet, defector that they'd gotten in contact with, and they would call them and say, "Hey, I got this guy in Jordan," and they breathlessly say he's going to do this, and they would run through a lot of the things that he had told them, and I would say, "Well, it is credible. I don't know if it's right or not, but it's credible." And this happened with this character Curveball. I mean, there was a source that came to Germany and the United States put a lot of weight on, and the intelligence community uses words in a funny way in which people don't understand. People say a source is credible. That just means that what he is saying does not require a new set of physics. It could be true or it might not be true, but it's not obviously wrong. People read that as a credible, meaning it's true. Sorry.
I'm going to take one last question. Yes. Sorry.
As a practicing political scientist, let me admit that one of the faults, especially in the IR field, is an emphasis on partly emerging issue about states are going to respond to their external security environment, and what drives WMD programs and tensions capabilities is the external security threats a state faces. But I think from reading Mr. Dulfer's book and the UNSCOM reports and other documents, it's pretty clear that Iraq had a very strong internal security motivation for acquiring and using and refusing to admit they didn't have WMD anymore. So I'm just wondering to what extent did Mr. Dulfer or other people in the U.S. government realize that there was an internal security motive here, and maybe there's anything from his debriefings of some of the senior Iraqis that maybe helped illustrate that tendency a little bit more?
Bill Miller, and then that's it. Can you pass the mic here, please? Thank you. These are the last two questions.
You worked with Icaeus and Blix. Why were their findings downgraded? Why were they ignored?
Look, on the first point, on the question of, I guess, comes to, were there internal requirements for WMD that Iraq had that we were perhaps not focusing on? Because certainly he used them internally in addition to against Iran. He used them against the Kurds, and then in 1991 it turns out he used them also against the Shia in the south. I'm not sure that, I mean, from the U.S. perspective, they didn't focus on that a lot. I mean, there were certainly a lot of other ways that Saddam could enforce his regime on the Iraqi people. That was not, when I talked to the Iraqis in 1995, that did not come up when we had a long discussion about the requirements for weapons of mass destruction. That was not the reason that they built these things. They evolved out of the 80s and largely for the external threats to satisfy that deterrent requirement, although they certainly use them internally. I'm not sure that further knowledge of that or further understanding of that would have shaped the U.S. assessments of it in any sense. I'm not sure I'm quite getting it to your question, but the internal applications didn't drive their force structure in a sense, except possibly with respect to BW, where there was they had 3 agents which they manufactured: aflatoxin, bot toxin, and anthrax. Aflatoxin is a very weird thing. It's something that causes liver cancer, and it might prevent a captain from becoming a colonel, but it doesn't have a lot of military applications. And so the only, we never got them to say this, but the only real application is a rather insidious one where it's meant to shape populations over the long term without necessarily having a fingerprint. I mean, it's something which causes long-term diseases. On the question about Blix and Achaeus, they're 2 different questions in a sense, because Achaeus headed UNSCOM and Blix headed what replaced UNSCOM later, UNMAVIC, and I don't think that, there's an argument that is said that inspections were working, that because Iraq did not have stocks of WMD, inspections worked, and that's taking a static picture, and what I tried to relate in this book, and in fact in the 2004 study, was there's a dynamic picture. In May of 2003, it is true that there were no weapons of mass destruction, on hand in Iraq. But that's one point on the curve, and what we tried to describe was, we wanted a calculus answer, not an algebraic one. What was the equation in Saddam's mind, where the coefficient of WMD was 0 at some points and at other points greater than 0. Now, all of the assumptions, all of the mindsets and biases were that WMD was good to Saddam. He would be crazy not to have it. So when Blix was sent in to do the inspections, and that course was largely elected to build international support for an ultimate goal of moving Saddam out of power, it became ensnarled in this UN resolution which is tied to WMD. And Blix was in the unfortunate position was he could only report what he saw, and what he saw was not consistent with what everybody was convinced was there. So why wasn't he? The problem was it didn't fit in with where everyone wanted the outcome to come to, I think, and we had made an argument that we tied the argument of going into Iraq to WMD. Now, an alternative, again, which demonstrates the limits, I think, of U.S. policy, an alternative might have been to go into the Security Council and say, look, this is a case, and I would draw an allusion to a speech that Kofi Annan made to the General Assembly in September of 1999, where he said there were occasions where the international community is justified in intervening in the affairs of another country. Now that's a pretty radical statement in the UN context. But at that point in time, Kofi Annan was speaking with respect with Kosovo in mind and Rwanda in mind. And had the United States gone to the Security Council and said, this is a case where having this guy in charge of Iraq, it's a threat to his own people, it's a threat to the region, and we need a new resolution which is not tied to WMD. That would have been a more honest approach. It would have been a very, very, very difficult argument to win in the Security Council. And I don't know how if at all, it was debated in the administration at the time, but that would have been, I think, a more forthright way of going about it.
Thank you very much, Charles. This was really wonderful. You can buy the book outside, and Charles has graciously agreed to sign it. Let me also draw your attention to a meeting we are having on Monday, February 23rd. It's another book discussion, this time on how to break a terrorist, the U.S. interrogators who used brains, not brutality, to take down the deadliest man in Iraq. And there is a list of upcoming meetings up there. Thank you. Please join me in thanking our two speakers.